My name's Carol. I grew up in a very small town out near Rochester, Minnesota called Plainview. It was a very quiet place right in the middle of a farm country, and back in the 40s, maybe only 1,000 or so people called it home. We'd swim in the creek during summer break and then sled down hills in the winter, but all year round, Sundays were special. Come Sunday, everyone in town went to church, and then afterwards it was home for potluck dinners with neighbors who helped each other when things got tough. Budget running a little thin? People'd pitch in and leave a blank envelope of cash in your mailbox. Barn burned down after a lightning strike? Folks would show up with hammers and food. I remember that. I learned to work hard and love my neighbors, and of all of our neighbors, no one was loved quite as much as Edith Olson. From what I remember of her, she was the kind of woman who could make you feel warm, even on the coldest of winter days. She was graceful, tall and pretty, with light brown hair and a big smile that always carried to her shining blue eyes. She was a God-fearing woman, too, and every Sunday you'd see her standing out front of the Lutheran church with an old, near-worn-out Bible that she was oh so very proud of. But life hadn't been easy for Edith. Back in the 30s, when I was still a little kid, Edith's husband, Lars, had a terrible accident at home. Word has it that he was up on top of the barn fixing roof shingles after a big storm when he suddenly slipped and fell to his death. His sudden passing left her a widow at just 38 years old and with a young daughter to raise too. Little Ruth Olson was still being breastfed when her father died, and when he passed, the whole town descended on Edith's home to help take care of her and the baby, not with the breastfeeding though, I'd imagine. Now, despite her being half an orphan, it seemed like little Ruth had a bright future ahead of her, as a little girl who had a very special place in everyone's heart. But then, when she was just a couple of years old, little Ruth got sick, really sick, and she never quite recovered. Now, by age 5, it was clear that she wouldn't grow up the same as other children and would most likely be confined to a wheelchair. She was also clear that she'd have to live on a cocktail of medications in order to keep her various conditions in check, all of which were down to the illness she suffered within her infancy. God was challenging her in a big way, but Edith never complained. She'd always say, "The Lord provides, and so do good neighbors," and wasn't that just the truth? The wheelchair, the medicines, and all the home modifications Edith needed didn't come cheap, and so to pay for it, Edith put on bake sales down at the church or set up tables outside the hardware store covered in pies and cookies. Now, I've had many a happy memory of walking past Edith's pop-up stalls, but as I came to learn, it wasn't all her work. About 90% of it was baked by other people who happily donated their goods for Edith to profit from. Thanks to her husband's life insurance, she didn't even really need the money either. It was just extra to make sure that little Ruth had the most comfortable life possible. And besides, someone who'd been through that much in their life needed to keep their hands busy, lest the devil make work for them, as the saying goes. For years, Edith was the recipient of endless charity, like in the wintertime when Ruth's medication was paid for by the Christmas quilt raffle down at the town hall, as well as the 50-cent hot dish suppers after church services. And things stayed like that for years and years and years, because Edith, and little Ruthie by extension, they were like the town's talismans. Despite all Edith had been through, she still kept a smile on her face and she still praised God. But as Ruth got older, her condition got worse. I remember there was a time when no one saw her for a while, and then when Ruth re-emerged, she was completely mute and immobile, being pushed around in her chair by her mom. And it was so sad to see because before, Ruth had been able to move her arms and hands to complete simple tasks, and had even been able to get a few words out here and there. People assumed that she was dumb, but she wasn't. She just couldn't express herself very well. But then, by the time she was maybe 13 to 14, Ruth could barely even move her eyes anymore. Edith would push her around the grocery store asking her questions, but getting no answers, and it tore people up inside to see it getting to her. Once again, they rallied to her cause and helped put a smile back on the face of a woman that had so often made themselves smile. But then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse for poor Edith, they somehow did. Now, like I said, Edith was well taken care of by her neighbors, so much so that when a strange man was noticed to be parked outside her house for a few hours, one of them moseyed on over to ask him his business. The man was very rude in response, so rude in fact that Edith's neighbor decided to call the Washita County Sheriff's Department to report him. The sheriff sent out one of his deputies who told the guy to move along before he got himself arrested for loitering or some such offense. The guy made tracks after grumbling something about being an honest citizen, but then a couple of days later, he showed up again, and that time, he was banging on Edith's door. Once again, the sheriff is called, and once again a deputy heads over to tell the guy to move on. It turns out Edith was cowering inside with little Ruthie, who explained that she'd met the man after answering a personals ad for lonely widows. She'd spoken to him on the phone a few times, decided that she didn't want to date, and then tried to break things off. But the man didn't take it well. Not at all. She had him charged with trespassing on the property, and he was warned that if he showed up in town again, he'd spend the night in jail. But apparently that didn't deter Edith's spurned telephone companion. Not even a week after the man had trespassed, he was caught sneaking up Edith's driveway in the middle of the night by a man letting his dog out front to use the bathroom. The cops were called for a third time, but instead of fleeing once he'd been spotted, the man continued his attempt to break into Edith's home. When the deputies arrived, the sheriff himself was with them, and as promised, Edith's ex, if you can even call it that, was immediately taken to jail. I heard he left town the next morning with a black eye and a busted lip, all the result of his uncooperative attitude while in custody, and that was the official story anyway. The unofficial one, as in the truth, circulated much slower. While in custody, the sheriff wanted to know why Edith's ex couldn't take no for an answer, and so he asked him. And when he did, what came out of the stranger's mouth made the sheriff so furious that he beat the living hell out of him, and he had to be dragged away by his deputies. I don't know if anyone but the sheriff heard exactly what was said, but word had it that the man had made a very serious accusation regarding Edith Olsen and her daughter Ruth. One so foul and disgusting that not only did he refuse to repeat it, but the sheriff felt the need to defend Edith's honor with such ferocity. Years went by, and as little Ruth blossomed into a young woman, her conditions only got worse. She became completely catatonic, with Ruth having to bathe her, feed her, and change her diapers. And then whenever she needed to get housework done or cook dinner, Edith would sit Ruth in front of the radio and would tune the dial to whichever station was hosting a radio play. Ruth loved radio theater, and I remember loving them myself around that time too. I used to imagine her listening to Lights Out, The Man Called X, or my personal favorite, The Lone Ranger. I used to enjoy the old reruns of Mail Call and The March of Time too, stuff from back when the war was on, but I imagine Ruth got more of a kick out of Little Orphan Annie than old war stories. But on that point, I could not have been more wrong. One day, Edith was out pushing Ruthie around when they stopped by the post office for some reason. I don't know what the heck Edith was doing in there, something money-related probably, but as she's standing there doing whatever she's doing, a nearby clerk noticed Ruthie was looking right at him. Herb Cooper was a kindly older man, and so he smiled and waved at Ruthie without expecting anything in return. He knew Ruthie could barely move by then, and so imagine his surprise when he noticed her finger tapping on the arm of her wheelchair. Herb said later that he didn't know if she was doing it on purpose or if it was just a reflex thing, but all the same, she's staring right at him as he's leaning on the counter waiting for a customer. But then, old Herb notices something about the way Ruth was tapping, something that had a strange rhythm about it that was instantly familiar to him. She was tapping out 3 quick taps, 3 long taps, and then 3 quick taps again, and then she'd wait, staring right at him, and then do it all over again. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Herb knew that pattern anywhere because he'd learned it during his time in the military. It was Morse code, the kind that they used to tap out over the wire, and it meant SOS. When Edith wheeled Ruth back out again with a big smile and a cheery goodbye, Herb had to force a fake one. He couldn't quite believe what he'd just seen, even though the evidence of it had been right there in front of him, and when he went home for dinner that night, he told his wife what had happened. It was Mrs. Cooper who told him to search his soul and to go talk to the sheriff if he thought he needed to. Well, Herb did some soul-searching all right, because the very next morning he drove to the sheriff's office and told the sheriff himself what he'd seen at the post office. Herb was as reliable as the rising sun, so coming from him, the sheriff knew to take it seriously and went over to Edith's home to have a talk with her. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is when the proverbial cat was let out of the bag. The sheriff figured something was wrong when Edith refused to let him inside and insisted they walk out on the step for everyone to hear. Now, the sheriff told her what he had to say wasn't something that she wanted people to hear, but Edith insisted, and it took the sheriff promising to return with a warrant for her to step aside from the doorway and invite him in. And while once he was inside, the sheriff caught a glimpse of what was really going on in that house. And let me tell you, it wasn't pretty. Despite keeping the outside of her home spotless, the inside was another story entirely. It was filthy, with moldy food in the refrigerator, dying houseplants standing in vases full of stagnant water, and what could only be described as a stack of Ruth's dirty diapers just piled up in the kitchen. I heard Edith tried explaining it away by saying that she hadn't had time to clean in a couple of days, but somehow she managed to keep her own bedroom clean as a whistle while keeping Ruth's like a damned pigsty. He later said it looked like the poor girl's sheets hadn't been washed in years, and how what had once been bright white cotton was tinged in this faded yellow. Edith continued to make excuses as the sheriff toured her horror show of a home, but the final straw was what passed for her medicine cabinet. Edith claimed that Ruth needed all kinds of medications, including blood thinners, kidney regulators, and all kinds of other stuff like that. But upon looking in her medicine cabinet, the sheriff didn't spot anything of the sort. He wasn't a doctor, of course, but he'd confiscated enough pills for enough pillheads over the years to recognize a tranquilizer when he saw one. He knew Ruth needed sleeping pills too, as she sometimes found it difficult to get a rest at night. But Edith must have had 24 bottles of farm animal-grade tranquilizer in there, the kind of stuff that they give to bulls before they go under the knife for whatever reason, along with a ton of anti-anxiety meds and strong pain medication. There wasn't a single medication meant for any of Ruthie's so-called conditions, only stuff to keep her still and placid while her mom pushed her around in a wheelchair. The sheriff had his suspicions right away, and he couldn't arrest her for child abuse right there and then. Instead, he put her in handcuffs for some kind of narcotics violation for owning regulated medications that she didn't have a prescription for. But then once Edith was in custody, he ordered a full investigation into Ruth's treatment, and that's how the cops discovered that Edith's entire life was little more than a lie. She'd been pretending her daughter was sick ever since she was a baby, and then by the time Ruth was old enough to realize she wasn't sick, Edith needed to ensure her continued compliance, and so she started drugging her. She didn't just drug her daughter either. She beat her, starved her, and psychologically tortured her by telling Ruth that everything, and I mean everything, was her fault. Everything from her father's death to her condition was Ruth's fault, and if she ever tried to escape or alert anyone to what her mother was doing, she'd be killed. And this was all discovered after Ruth was placed in foster care and was being taken care of by people who genuinely cared about her. They fed her to get her strength up and helped her through the withdrawals from all the medication that she was no longer being given. And then slowly but surely, as the drugs cycled out of her system, Ruth began talking again, and she told her story in full. It turns out Edith was telling the truth about the telephone companion who tried breaking into her house. She had met with him after responding to a Lonely Hearts ad, one which claimed to specialize in widows. The man himself was a widower, and apparently she and the stranger had shared something of a budding friendship. But then somehow, and for whatever God-forsaken reason, Edith let slip about the way she treated her daughter. She didn't tell her new companion everything. In fact, it was just one little line that aroused his suspicions. And that line involved her taking great pleasure in punishing little Ruthie for what her mother called her sins of the flesh. I guess with him being a religious man, Edith expected her companion to understand. But just like any other sane person, he questioned how a severely disabled young woman could ever deserve such punishments when she was too weak to talk, let alone walk. Apparently, and under the guise of offering Edith some financial assistance, he asked to come over to check out their living conditions. Edith was all for taking the man's money, but when she'd refused to let him anywhere near the house and said that she'd shoot him if he tried, he naturally grew more and more suspicious. He knew Edith lived in Plainview, he just didn't know where. But all it took was a little ride around town, talking to folks about the town's very own angel in human form to figure out where her house was. After that came the sightings of him, and apparently he was only rude to Edith's neighbor because he believed the whole town was in on Ruth's abuse. She talked at length about this big support network she had and how everyone in town loved her and would do anything for her. And so our telephone companion assumed the whole town was bad, hence why he kept on coming back despite warnings from deputies. He ended up telling the sheriff right to his face that Edith Olsen was subjecting her own daughter to a living nightmare of hellish proportions. But like we already covered, the sheriff had been so well fooled by Edith's act that he beat the living crap out of the guy for even suggesting she was bad. I don't know if the sheriff ever got around to apologizing to this guy, but I guess not, as doing so would be an admission that his injuries weren't the result of a bad fall or bumping his head while they were trying to get him into his cell. But I know he apologized to the people of Plainview for not figuring it all out years ago and saving poor little Ruthie a whole world of suffering. Edith ended up going to jail, and for a heck of a long time, too. So long I heard that she died in prison back in the 80s. And then aside from being set up with a foster family someplace, I'm not sure what happened to poor Ruthie. I hope she's living a good life somewhere with a good family by her side too. And I hope all the physical and mental wounds have healed, but if they're anything like the psychological wounds suffered by the folks of Plainview, then they took a long, long time to heal. And see, it wasn't just the suspicions that destroyed the social fabric of my hometown. It was the guilt. Folks realized that they didn't really know their neighbors, not in the way that they liked to imagine they did anyway, and that did its own damage. But the guilt, the crushing, inescapable guilt of knowing they'd stood by and done nothing, it destroyed them. People blamed each other, blamed themselves, blamed God for allowing such a nightmare to continue for years and years unabated. And by the time I graduated high school and started looking at colleges to attend, I couldn't wait to get the hell out of town and to some place that didn't have this big, dark cloud hanging over it. I've been back since, and like I said, things finally seem to have changed around town and reverted back to the wholesome, peaceful, and trusting place it used to be. People still tell the story of the evil old witch, Edith Olsen. But to the kids, it's nothing more than a scary story from a different time, something that can affect them or hurt them. But to folks like me, who are old enough to remember all that evil, hatred, and mistrust, it feels as close as yesterday. People are always quite surprised when I tell them, but I used to be in a band. Not just a pub or garage band either, although I've the utmost respect for working musicians everywhere, but a band that was right on the cusp of being signed. Now, yet right at the moment of truth, something came along and burst our bubble in the most horrifying way imaginable. And long story short, I ended up playing a little acoustic set at this gig during my first year of uni. I got the crowd going with a cover of American Pie, turned it into a bit of a sing-along, and then had a few pints with my guitar case next to me watching the other bands play. One of the groups was a three-piece who covered songs by artists that I liked. Things like Zeppelin, Hendrix, a bit of Dylan, stuff like that. And we got chatting after their set, and they invited me to come and jam with them, and the rest was history. And the three-piece became a four-piece. They really needed someone who could do backing, play rhythm, and essentially play second fiddle to their singer and lead guitarist, Richie. Richie could sing like Robert Plant and shred like Jimmy Page, the kind of frontman that every great rock band needs, and so I was only too happy to be the sort of polish that made him shine kind of thing, and shine he did. The bassist and drummer said that I was like the missing fourth piece of the puzzle. Two lads who, funnily enough, were both named Andy. The Andys, as I started calling them, were both great lads and talented musicians in their own right, but they both agreed that I was a great addition, and I loved them for how welcome they made me feel. Anyway, we started gigging together with a new set list, and one that we were really freaking proud of, too. And then we started kicking down doors all over Sheffield, Manchester, and Leeds at whatever gigs we could get our names on, and very quickly, we started attracting attention. At one gig, we had an A&R guy ask us for a demo, and then it wasn't long before we got a call back from a bloke inviting us down to none other than Columbia Records. Columbia is a huge label, so as you can imagine, getting an invite from them was as flattering as it was exciting. We went down to London for what was basically an audition, and then after sitting down with some bigwig and the A&R guy that we'd met, we were told to basically go away, write 8 songs of our strongest possible material, and then get ready to record them, tour the country, and then release our debut. It was what you'd call a development deal, something record companies do to make sure that you're all but locked into a contract with them before any others get their greedy little mitts on you. But at the time, we were over the moon, and the future looked very bright indeed. But those next few months, my God, they were exhausting. We kept on going to uni, but no one went home for Easter break, and pretty much all of our free time was spent in our practice space writing songs and trying out said songs at various gigs that we were now being sought out to play. It was honestly one of the happiest and most fun-filled times of my entire life. And thanks to the little stipend Columbia paid us, so we had money to write the album, I had real cash in my pocket for the first time in my life. We all did, and it was fantastic. But burning the candles at both ends, jamming all night and then going to uni the next morning, it started to really take its toll on us, but especially Richie. Richie was the driving force of the band, and without a doubt, and although we were all excited about the development deal, etc., Richie seemed to literally high on the excitement. He didn't sleep for almost 50-something hours over one weekend because every time he tried to doze off, he kept getting ideas for licks or lyrics that he just had to record or write down. He seemed like he was getting into a real state at one point. Like he seemed all frazzled and scatterbrained from the sleep deficit. It didn't help that we were drinking a lot too, but then one day, Richie met this girl who quickly became his girlfriend, and he was suddenly his old self again. Now we were thinking, oh he's probably sleeping like the dead after rolling around all night with her. But we weren't complaining, not when he basically wrote the entire album in 3 weeks, with our contributions of course, and it was fantastic. But then, not long after the album was accepted by our A&R guy and he started looking for a producer for us, Richie started acting all strange. He'd either be super upbeat and positive or ultra moody and negative, like totally bipolar, and the same could be said for his energy levels. He was either raring to go and full of beans or nodding out in his chair like he hadn't slept in days. It was obvious that he was taking drugs of some kind. We just didn't know which ones, as we were actually very naive and innocent for 4 lads on the verge of being rock stars. We never shared anything stronger than a bottle of Jack Daniels before going on stage together, so imagine our surprise when after staging a little intervention on Richie's behalf, we find out that he'd been juggling both a speed habit and a sleeping pill habit, all in pursuit of getting the album written. Now, it was quite an emotional intervention, really, because we knew that he was only doing it for the benefit of the band. It wasn't like he was out there doing coke and sharing needles in the pursuit of hedonism. He was staying up for days writing music while doing speed to keep him awake, and then taking loads of sleeping pills to put himself down so he didn't have a complete mental breakdown. That stopped for a while, surprisingly effectively, in fact. But then one day, it stopped working, and both his body and mind really started to suffer. He'd kept it a secret from us because he knew that we'd put a stop to it, but he was so completely terrified of losing that development deal, there are loads of clauses in them, time frame being one of them, that he turned to better living through chemistry, as it were. And the point is, we had to get him clean and at least partially sober before we went to sign that deal and cut the record, or Columbia would drop us like a live hand grenade. It wasn't easy. We had to cancel gigs, lie to the A&R guy, and delay our next meeting, and then make sure that Richie didn't relapse or lean too heavy on the booze or the weed. It wasn't pretty either. It got really ugly at times, but in the end, Richie emerged clean, sober, and ready to fulfill what I firmly believe was his destiny. We arranged that second meeting down in London, got ready to show off what we'd put together then, and then off we went. Just not as a group. For reasons I can't quite remember now, only me and Andy the bassist were getting the train together. Richie was getting a later train with his girlfriend, who had to work, while Andy the drummer was going to drive down to London early the next morning as he had to give drum lessons and didn't want to cancel. It's also worth noting that Andy the drummer had recently broken up with his girlfriend, Laura, and while he was a bit down about it, it in no way looked like it was going to compromise the deal, so no one was worried. Now anyway, me and Andy got to our hotel and then spent all night chatting because we were so excited. We showed up at Columbia right and early the next morning, and at first we're the only ones there. This didn't bother me at first, as we'd arrived early like I said, but then as the minutes rolled on and there was no sign of Richie, me and Andy, the bassist, started to worry. Now we're thinking, he wouldn't relapse and mess this whole thing up the night before, would he? And while we wanted to say no, there was this real sense of, actually, we don't know. And that was a pretty horrible feeling, let me tell you. Imagine our whole future falling apart right there before our eyes, but then just as I was starting to really despair, who should show up but Richie? I don't think I'd ever been so relieved or pleased to see him, and we both gave him and his girlfriend big hugs when they got out of the taxi right there in front of us, but then after the hugs and the smiles and the thank God you're here, Richie asks, "Where's Andy?" And it was only then that we realized that no one had spoken to him. It was one of those, I thought you texted him. No, I thought you texted him kind of situations. But no one had. No one had called him either, but we still weren't worried at first because Andy the drummer was always Mr. Reliable. And that's half the reason they had him as the drummer in the first place, before I joined the band, I mean, because without a drummer you pretty much got nothing. If your bassist doesn't turn up, you can get by with just a guitar and drums. Look at the white stripes and the black keys. You could even do an instrumental set if your singer doesn't turn up and get the audience to do the singing. And with the rest of the set list, that works surprisingly well. But if your drummer doesn't turn up, you're buggered. And since Andy the drummer always bloody turned up, we had absolute faith that he was going to show up, and it was simply running a little bit late. But then, despite all three of us calling him in turn, Andy picked up his phone. In fact, when he gave it a second round of calls just minutes after, someone had switched it off. We waited 5 minutes, and then 15, and then we had to go inside to risk being late for the meeting. We lied to the A&R and company man's face, saying Andy had gotten sick with food poisoning and he was 100% reliable otherwise. Because again, it was still mega important to make good impressions and not make ourselves look unreliable. They ate it up, as the three of us were clearly really excited to be there, but the whole time I've got this heavy, anxious feeling in my chest thinking, where the actual freak is Andy? Everything went fine at the meeting, and we arranged to meet again less than a week later to sign all the actual contracts, at which point Andy really needed to be there. We felt like we dodged a bullet at first, and that it was simply a case of getting hold of Andy before A, finding out what had happened, and B, making sure he wasn't going to pull the same crap the following week when we needed to put pen to paper. So literally, the moment we got back to Sheffield, me and Andy the bassist thumbed down a black cab and asked the driver to take us to Andy the drummer's address. Andy was actually from Sheffield, so he lived with his mum and dad in a nice house near the Steel Bank. And then when we pulled up outside, Andy's car was in the driveway, so we assumed he was home. But when we knocked on the door and his mom answered, I recognized immediately that something was wrong. It was the look on her face, the one that says, I've got bad news to tell you, and since she knew us quite well at that point, she just told us, I think you two best come inside. Now, as we walked through the living room and Andy the drummer's mom asked if we wanted a cup of tea, all I could think was, oh my God, something happened and he's either dead or he's in hospital about to die. And so when she told me he was fine, at least in terms of his health, I felt this sort of premature feeling of relief. But that feeling disappeared entirely when Andy's mom explained that her son had been arrested. The first question out of our mouths was, "What for?" And looking back on it, I think his mom knew exactly why, and she just didn't have the heart to tell us. I don't blame her. I'd be horrified if my son was arrested on those kinds of charges, but the police always tell you why you're being arrested, don't they? So unless he was home alone when the police called around, there's no way his parents just didn't know why he'd been arrested. But like I said, I understand why she didn't tell us anything, and after we left, we had to kind of wade through the rumor mill before we found out what he'd actually been charged with. My first bet was drugs, because if Richie kept a secret habit, so could Andy. But it was so much worse than that, because Andy had been charged with both possession of indecent images of children and assault on a child under the age of 16. We found out when a news article was shared around Facebook with people either saying "dirty nunts" or "oh my god, I know this guy." Part of me believed it was all just some horrible mistake, but when Andy disconnected his phone, packed his bags, and just disappeared, we realized it was all true. The next thing we heard is that he'd pled guilty and received a very lengthy prison sentence due to aggravating circumstances. Apparently what he did to the kid that he met online was so bad, the judge gave him the maximum possible sentence. And then after that, it was gone. But so was the band, and so was our future. The record label didn't want anything to do with us after they found out what had happened to Andy, and the whole thing messed with Andy's head so much that he ended up getting mad into the drink for a while before he dropped off the map. Me and Andy the bassist tried putting a band together for a while, but the stink of what Andy the drummer had done was so bad that it followed us wherever we went. And in the end, I just sort of fell out of love with playing live music and jamming with other musicians. I still like playing guitar, it just became much more of a private thing before I swapped the guitar for a weight rack and started on my fitness journey. It became impossible to think about playing music without thinking about playing with my old band, and whenever I thought about playing with my old band, my mind would inevitably turn to what Andy the drummer had done, and more specifically, the kid he'd abused so horribly. I ended up trying to reach out to the victim and their family, but the courts are really strict on identities, so I didn't get the chance to, and maybe that's for the best. I just hope Andy didn't do too much psychological damage and that they've found a degree of happiness in their lives, because they're the reason I'm very careful about my own kids having access to the internet. Way back in the day, when I was still in my early 20s, I used to rent a bedsit in Croydon. Now, for you Americans listening, Croydon is a part of South London, and a bedsit is what we call a studio apartment. Now, basically just a bed, a kitchenette, and an attached bathroom, all in one room. Now, I found it after my mom kicked me out. Now, long story, we have a better relationship now, and I was really grateful to the landlord, a guy called Vic, who basically fast-tracked the whole application process so I could keep a roof over my head. Vic turned out to be a really chilled-out fella. He wasn't the kind of landlord to hold surprise inspections. He always got repairs and maintenance issues sorted as quickly as he could, and he was great about warning other tenants about loud music or late-night get-togethers, and so naturally I didn't mess about when it came to rent with him. I had it ready, all 400 quid of it, on the first day of every month, and me and Vic always had ourselves a little chat and a catch-up whenever he came over. Now this went on for nearly 5 years, and although it wasn't strictly the nicest place to live, West Croydon can be a bit rough, I was very happy there. I was able to patch things up with my mom, I had somewhere to take girls, and I had my freedom. And then one day, on the first of the month, Vic didn't show up to collect the rent. I got a bit worried about him because it was the first time in literally 5 years that he hadn't showed up to collect. At least the first time where he hadn't warned me in advance that collection would be late. Now, it wasn't exactly desperate to part with my rent money, I mean, who really is? But I liked Vic, and I was a bit worried about him, so I tried giving him a call. Now, his phone was busy the first time I tried, and then busy the second time too. And then when I tried about an hour later, I got one of those automated, "this person's phone is switched off" messages. The only thing I could think of at the time was that he'd been taken ill, seriously ill too by the looks of things, and that I'd have to just be patient and wait for him to show up and collect the rent. A few days later, I got a knock on my door from a guy claiming to be Vic's nephew, who's there to collect the rent. Now right away I'm very suspicious. I've never seen this guy before in my life, and I still can't get Vic on the phone to confirm whether or not this was his nephew. Now I ended up telling the lad in the nicest way possible to just F off and not come back till he had proof that he was Vic's nephew. I was definitely in the mentality of this has to be a scam of some variety, but the guy claiming to be the nephew actually seemed to respect my position. And that had me questioning myself a bit, but I still thought that it was best to only hand cash over to Vic. And so I waited and waited, but Vic still didn't show up, and he still didn't return any of my calls. It wasn't until the first of the next month that I started to get worried again. I told myself Vic would be around with an explanation and to collect the 2 months' worth of rent that I owed him, but as you can probably guess, he didn't show up and he didn't call. And I expected another knock from his nephew, but that didn't come either. Now a whole 3rd month rolled around and I still hadn't paid anyone any rent. And then you guessed it, there was no sign of Vic or his nephew, who I now believe was legitimately his nephew. And then a few days later I got a knock on the door. I'm expecting it to be Vic or his quote-unquote nephew, but it was neither. It was a woman from the council, and she'd come to serve me an eviction notice. The only clue that she gave me was that she told me the property had been seized by the government, and since it was due to be sold at auction, I obviously had to leave. I asked her what was going on with Vic, but she said that she didn't know. All she knew was that the building was due to be seized to pay for money that he owed. At the time, I assumed Vic had been fiddling with his taxes or something. I paid him all the rent in cash, and so I'd assumed that he wasn't reporting all of his income, probably. And then when I got word about the seizure, I thought his luck had finally run out. But it wasn't taxes he owed, and while I had to wait quite a while to work out what had happened, it wasn't any less shocking for me when I found out. Basically, Vic had the outward appearance of a legitimate landlord, and I suppose to me, he was just that. But as it turns out, Vic had another tenant of sorts, one he didn't tell another living soul about outside of his immediate family. This tenant didn't pay any rent, but technically he didn't make any money either because Vic was using the guy for slave labor. Now, to cut a long story short, a young man had arrived in the UK illegally from Vietnam about 10 years prior. He heard about the flats that Vic was renting, but didn't have any money or papers to be able to move in, and while most landlords wouldn't be interested in entertaining someone like that and might point them in the direction of a homeless shelter, Vic did the opposite, but for reasons that were anything but charitable. As it happens, Vic wanted to get into growing weed in the basement of his house. It turns out a friend of his was involved in the drug trade and told him what a perfect spot his basement would be for growing some ganja. Now, his wife and grown-up son were fine with it, as it meant having loads of extra cash coming in. The only trouble was, none of them knew how to grow it. And so when he asked the Vietnamese fellow what skills he had, and the Viet guy said that he'd worked on a vegetable farm or something back home, Vic saw an opportunity. He enlisted the Vietnamese guy's help in converting his basement into what was basically a one-bedroom flat, with one portion of it dedicated to a living space and the other converted into a small-scale weed farm. Now, the Viet guy stayed in Vic's basement the whole time, and then once all the growing supplies were there, he was offered a job, or rather, a job that very quickly turned out to be no job at all. The Vietnam guy was told that if he stayed in the basement and grew weed for Vic, he'd be able to stay in the country. Vic would keep him safe and secret down there and would pay for all of his meals, etc. without charging any rent. He was free to explore the back garden so long as it was at night, but he obviously couldn't freely go walking about because the police would arrest him and send him back to Vietnam. Or at least, that's what the Vietnamese guy was told. Vic made out like he was doing the guy a favor, and that he'd sort him out with false documents and all that once he'd grown a few grand's worth of puff for him. But then once he'd sold his first crop and realized how much money he could make, he started lying to the Vietnamese guy and basically saying that he couldn't leave. Vic said the immigration people had been sniffing around. They hadn't, and that it wasn't safe for him to come out. He also said the Vietnamese guy owed him money for rent and food and energy bills and all of that, so he couldn't leave till he paid them off. It got to the point Vic would start locking the door to the basement and putting a bookcase in the way so nobody could see it. And so within just a few short months, that Vietnamese fella had gone from a legal immigrant to a modern-day slave. Apparently this went on for literally years, with conditions for the immigrant guy getting worse and worse, till one day, he snapped. Vic was in his 50s or 60s, and the Vietnamese guy was in his 20s by the time he escaped, so he easily overpowered him when Vic came down in the basement one day and then said he could either release him or die. And Vic chose not to die. The article I read online said the Vietnamese lad ended up getting picked up by the police for stealing a sandwich from Greg's. And then after he told his story, the police went to check if what he said was true, and that's when they found Vic's little grow operation. He hadn't even bothered to dismantle it, having most likely assumed that the Viet guy was too scared to talk to the police. But he was dead wrong about that, wasn't he? Because this Vietnamese lad was so pissed off that he'd been lied to and mistreated for so long that he sang like a canary once they got him down at the station. I suppose he was looking for revenge for what Vic did to him, and you can bet your arse he got it. Not only did Vic, his wife, and his son go to prison for a mix of drugs and modern slavery offenses, but the Vietnamese guy ended up getting tens of thousands of pounds in compensation, a lot of it generated from the sale of Vic's rental properties. Now, I'm not sure what happened to him after that, if he stayed in the UK or went home with his payout, because I imagine he could live like a king back in Vietnam with the exchange rate being what it is. Either way, I wish him all the best, but for me, the scariest thing is how Vic came across as this nice, laid-back fella, when in reality, he was probably the only person I ever met that I can comfortably describe as evil. A long time ago, almost 20 years in fact, a female friend set me up on a blind date with a guy named Ryan. He was a buddy of her boyfriend's, one he spoke very highly of, and for reference, I was a 28-year-old woman when we met, while he was almost a whole 10 years older at 37. My friend promised me that he was good-looking and that he had a good job, all that jazz. And while I hated the idea of a blind date and how it made me feel so incapable, I didn't regret going. Ryan was a truly beautiful man, but then once we got talking, I understood why he was single. First off, he sounded like a legit workaholic, and while he admitted that that was something he needed to work on, it leads me to the second thing, his poor communication skills. I called my girlfriend on my cell from the bathroom, and then she says, "Oh, he's just shy, let him warm up a little." And at the time, I thought that she was right. I was patient with him, told him he didn't have to worry about offending me or upsetting me. I mean, not within reason anyway. And then over the next month or two, Ryan really opened up to me. He didn't become some social butterfly overnight or anything. He was always kind of soft-spoken and reserved, but what I found out about him, I liked. He was super into ancient history, and I'm Greek on my mom's side, so I thought that was really cool. And then he was super into cooking too, which was really attractive for all the obvious reasons. But the thing, or rather place, that Brian seemed to have the most passion for was the Philippines. And when I visited his place, I saw all kinds of photos, souvenirs, and traditional Filipino artwork. I asked him why he was so interested in the Philippines, and he said he'd vacationed there a bunch as a child, as well as an adult of his own volition. His grandpa served there during World War II, so he'd brought Ryan's dad over a bunch to see how beautiful it was. And from the pictures, it was clearly one of the prettiest places on Earth. There were pictures of Ryan standing on white, sandy beaches in the company of various people, and then photos of him out in the jungle that he said were from nature tours. All the food looked amazing, the people all sounded super friendly and welcoming, and I totally understood why Ryan and his family had such a huge love of the place. The relationship went from strength to strength. I met his parents, he met mine, and we went on a wonderful weekend vacation together in Mexico around the 8-month mark. Now everything was going amazingly. And then just short of our 1-year anniversary, Ryan asked if I wanted to move in with him. I wasn't 100% sure at first because I've never lived with a boyfriend before and figured that was something couples only did after maybe 2 or 3 years of dating. But since I did really like him, and he was everything I was looking for in a long-term partner in terms of cleanliness and having his crap together, I accepted, and then moved in the following month. We spent our 1-year anniversary together in our apartment, and I know I keep saying this, but at the time, I was very, very happy. Ryan and I seemed like a really good fit for each other, and all of my girlfriends kept asking, when's he going to pop the question? I think if things had continued for maybe another year or two without incident, I'd have accepted any proposal he offered me. But, and as I guess you've already figured out from the way I'm talking about Ryan, things didn't stay all hunky-dory, and it wasn't long before things got really, really dark. Okay, so remember when I said Ryan was a workaholic? Well, he never really got a handle on that. He worked in the city at some financial firm, running accounts or whatever the hell they do in those kinds of jobs, and I understood why he took it so seriously and why he worked so hard. And then at the risk of sounding shallow, he wasn't shy about spending money on me, so I tried my best to make it up to him in various ways. And one of those ways was cleaning the apartment. Ryan really appreciated me keeping our place looking nice, and we didn't have much in the way of boundaries either, so there was only one place that he didn't want to mess with, and that was this one particular cabinet in the closet that he kept in his office. It wasn't some super sinister thing, with him getting all weird and telling me not to dare go prying around or whatever. He didn't even bring it up. It was me after I saw all the delicate little trinkets that he had in there. The first time I cleaned his office, when I opened the top left-hand cabinet on this big old mirrored closet type thing, I saw it was full of little wooden figures. They'd been carved to look like man and wife, wearing traditional clothing and holding traditional weaponry, and the carving was so intricate and fine that I was scared to break them. I asked him if he was cool with me not cleaning that part of the closet since I didn't want to break anything, and then when he said that was fine, I just moved on to other stuff. Now this happened maybe 6 or 7 times more, I can't remember exactly, as I'd given the apartment a deep clean about once every 2 weeks. And then one day, I opened up the little cabinet thing that houses those figures and found it pretty damn dusty. Those little figures, all coupled up like they were, looked kind of sad covered in so much dust. But still, I didn't want to risk breaking them, so instead of cleaning them off, I decided to just take them out of the little cabinet very carefully and give the inside of the cabinet a clean instead. And so at the very least, they had a nice place to live, even if Ryan was neglecting them directly. Now I got the little footstool out of the bathroom and then took it into his office so I could get better access to the cabinet, which was just about arm's reach without it. I then took each set of figures, pair by pair, and set them carefully down on his desk before getting back on the footstool to dust the cabinet. I pushed the duster inside, and I was trying to get it all the way to the back when I suddenly felt the tip of the duster tapping against the rear wall. It felt pretty solid, so I figured that it wouldn't do any harm to really get in there, because I couldn't exactly scratch the wood with a duster, now could I? But when I did start trying to dust all the way to the back, I suddenly felt the rear of the wall give way. Now obviously I'm freaking out, thinking I just broke my boyfriend's cabinet, which was an antique passed down from his Austrian grandmother too, I think. And so my first thought was to go get my computer chair, bring it into Ryan's office, and then stand on it so I could maybe reach into the cabinet all the way and fix the part of the cabinet I broke. But when I did, I shined a little flashlight into the cabinet to see exactly what I was working with. I realized that I hadn't broke the back of the cabinet at all. It was a false wall, and behind it, there was a little wooden box. And now here's where I kind of get an existential crisis, right there in Ryan's office. I knew he was hiding something from me. I mean, there was a chance that he didn't know that stuff was there, but considering it had those familiar sort of Filipino designs carved into it, I considered that a highly unlikely scenario. And so the only logical explanation was he was hiding something from me. And now I knew it could have been pictures of old girlfriends, maybe even nudie pictures, and while I do think holding on to stuff like that is kind of obviously in bad taste, I totally understood that he had a past, just like I did. But then, if it wasn't souvenirs from old conquests, then it had to either be drugs, weird adult images, or worse. And I wasn't going to risk that being the case and me not knowing about it. Not in a million years. I removed the box from its little hidey hole, then set it down on Ryan's desk, and then saw it had a little padlock keeping it closed. One that was small but very sturdy looking. I thought that was me out of luck, but just on a hunch, I checked the little hole for a key and, hey, presto, there was something shining at the back which fit the padlock. I took it off, opened up the box, and prepared myself to face whatever it was. But when I saw it, it was worse than anything I'd imagined. Far, far worse. When I first saw pictures of a grinning Ryan posing with naked children, you can imagine what my first thought was. I dropped the photo back inside, shut the box, and then found myself thinking, that's not what I saw, and you gotta make sure. Besides whatever kind of illegal activity was going on, it was going to the police in its photographic form, and so either way, I needed to open it up again and look inside. And so I did, and that's how I saw that they weren't being touched, or at least not in the photographs anyway, because the kids Ryan was posing with in the photos I was 90% certain were taken in the Philippines were dead. And I'm not talking dead like died in a disaster or something and Ryan was documenting it for evidence or something. I'm talking like they showed obvious signs of being violently murdered in various different ways, slaughtered like animals, just like they do with pigs over on farms. I saw it once I was on vacation, how the pig's head was drenched in blood, and put two and two together before having sleepless nights with a lot of crying. Now, I'm sorry for telling you all of this. I guess I got a little too emotional there and I decided to take a quick break, but now I'm back to writing and I don't want to write about those photographs anymore. I can't think about them without crying, and so if it's okay with this submission, I'm going to focus on what I did after I'd put one of the photos in a book. I didn't have an envelope handy, and I drove straight to the nearest police precinct to show them what I'd found. As you can imagine, that made for quite a scene. But I couldn't bring myself to walk inside for almost a full 15 minutes because I had a full-on mental breakdown while sitting in the parking lot and wondering how the hell I could have been so stupid. Ryan was not who he made himself out to be, obviously. Or at least he had a deep, dark secret that he really didn't want people to know about. And at the time, I told myself that there must have been 1,000 clues along the way that I just didn't pick up on because I'm a total freaking idiot. I don't see it quite the same way these days, but I still regret not cleaning that mother effing cabinet out sooner. And I also regret not biding my time a little and then going to the cops the next morning while Ryan was at work. That way they could have actually arrested him and not showed up to an empty house with his suitcase and a bunch of clothes missing. I think I must have driven over to the police precinct at maybe 4:20 to 4:30 p.m., meaning I was still crying in the parking lot when Ryan arrived home a half an hour later and realized his little box of keepsakes had been found. And then by the time the cops showed up, he was gone. And they couldn't exactly track his car down because he'd left it right there in the driveway. I was questioned extensively on where he might have gone to hide out or where he might have fled the country to. My answer was the same to both if I had to put my money on it. I'd have bet on him being in the Philippines. 6 times a week and twice on Sundays, as they say. And they never did find him. The cops, I mean, and I heard they even linked up with the cops over in the Philippines to try and track this Ryan down. I don't know if they could connect him to any actual murders, but if those photos really were what they appeared to be, then there must have been rumors or something. Either way, Ryan was never found. At least to my knowledge he wasn't, and my best guess is he's living someplace far away. Maybe not even in the Philippines, but definitely under an assumed identity.